Welcome to Strongman Saturday, featuring weekly episodes with specialists who can help coaches and athletes improve in strongman. I'm your host, Heidi Campo. Joining us today is Joe Kenn, and we will be talking about strongman training for football players. Please remember to like and comment so we can get some anabolic dialogue going on this page. So let's kick things off with a few easy questions. Joe, can you tell everyone who you are, how long you've been involved in strongman, and what gives you like a unique or a helpful perspective?
Yeah, my name is Joe Kenn. I've been a strength and conditioning coach for team sports since the late 80s, And I got introduced to strongman probably like most others, watching it pop up in the late 70s and early 80s on TV when it was more, again, it was a TV event. And then it gravitated to the mid 90s when I was at Boise State and Mark Philippi was at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and he had just won America's Strongest Man, and World's Strongest Man started to get a little bit more popular in the States at that time. And we started implementing, we were one of the first schools at Boise State who actually started to implement various concepts of strongman training as a alternate form of conditioning and competition. So I would say probably that mid 90s is when I started to study it from a different perspective. Going through my career, we always did certain events, so to speak, throughout, and we can get a little bit more into some of that later. And then obviously when I went to Arizona State, one of my interns was Brian Shaw. Brian interned for us and I think it was like 2005-ish, and that's when we offered him a graduate assistant position to stay on, and that's when he really was at a conflicting time in his life of wanting to see if he still had this athletic peak in him, and he was intrigued by the strongman sport. And needless to say, one of his goals was to one day be world's strongest man, and he did that 4 times. So for me, that kind of resonated into a long-term relationship with Brian. Then cell phones happened, so that helped communication a lot differently with email. And then 2 years later...
I'm just going to stop you right there because you are the only coach who can go back far enough to say, then cell phones happened. I've been doing all these incredible things, then cell phones happened. Well, usually coaches are like,
cell phones
on
were
Instagram
there,
for 10 years.
When I was at Utah. Yeah, I first got my first cell phone when I was at Utah coaching, but then it really started picking up like, oh, you could take pictures on a camera. What's text messaging? But so then long story short, come around full circle, Brian's last 2 years of competition, he brought me on as part of the team as his strength and conditioning coach. And then, man, I learned a lot about the differences between training team sports, where the weight room is secondary, versus strength sports, where the weight room is the practice field. So I learned a tremendous amount from Brian. I think Brian learned a lot from me that helped him come across with some nagging injuries he had later in his career that continued to come up. So for me, the full circle aspect is I did compete. I can say I honestly competed in one event, Chad Coy's event that he used to have in Kokomo. That was 2009. So I can say I have actually competed in strongman. I use strongman events as part of what I call my meathead metabolics or my interval conditioning. But I've also learned how not to, I think you have to remember, I'm sure we'll get into this with the football players, is there's a difference between training to be a strongman versus utilizing strongman events as part of your package or your exercise pool for what your goals and aspirations are as a strength athlete when you are no longer in alleged competitive attack mode, especially for, the master's age athletes who probably were former athletes at a time and then don't want to necessarily go to OSG or something like that and compete as a master's, but they are invigorated by training like an athlete because it keeps them and their motivation fresh instead of your standard, hey, let's go to a gym and do a workout with no real goal or aspiration in mind. So strongman has kind of resonated with me many different ways.
Now, just for the listeners' edification, some people may or may not know, you worked for the NFL for a portion of your career. And during that time, didn't you win Strength Coach of the Year?
Yes. When you have really good players, you tend to be fortunate to win individual awards. And for me, I've been surrounded by terrific staff members and terrific athletes everywhere I've been. Since we both are familiar with the NSCA, and a lot of times this is who's going to be listening to us, I'm the only individual, and that includes Boyd Epley, to win the National Strength and Conditioning Collegiate Coach of the Year and Professional Coach of the Year through the NSCA. And then I also was the NFL Strength Coach of the Year, voted on by my peers in the National Football League. So those are very, humbling honors to receive, but a lot of it has to do with how great your locker room is, what type of staff you put together. And a lot of times it could be yearly success and it can be career-long success. And I think that the NSCA awards, because they're only one-time allowed winnable awards, is probably more of that career-based. And then obviously the year that I won Strength Coach of the Year, we went 15-1. So I'm sure that had a lot to do with how I was able to beat, if you want to say, or outvote the other 31 strength coaches in the NFL that year.
So let's talk a little bit about what that was, and then kind of segue back into strongman, because obviously today we're speaking to both football players and strongman. Some of you listeners might be both. When you were coaching football, what were some of the main things that you were doing in retrospect that was the same as strongman or different? And what were some of the things that you think really made your team so good? And it's not just the strength and conditioning, because we all know that's like the main part of it. But like you just said, it's the staff members, it's the locker room culture. So let's go beyond even just the programming and talking about how you cultivated that winning culture.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you have to learn is, and this is even more so now as the era of athletes is changing, is for individuals like ourselves, going to the weight room's easy. Like, we love that stuff. I mean, most of the people, if you're a member of the strongman SIG or the powerlifting SIG or any of those weight room related SIGs, you're fascinated with the weight room. The big thing is in team sports, most of those athletes see it as a chore. Like, some of them really continue to question, why do I got to come in here? Like, why do I have to go in there? Where for us, we want to be in there. But you got to remember, if you're a competitive strongman, that's your sport. Your practice field is the weight room. If you want to be the greatest football player that you can be, your practice field is the grass. The weight room's secondary. So I think a lot of times as strength coaches, we have to understand that there's a good chance nobody in the weight room loves it as much as you do. And we have to understand that they see this as a have to, not a want to. So the biggest thing you can do, and again, different position groups have a different understanding. Like, even if an offense or defensive lineman really isn't a weight room guy, or they understand there's a value in it for them. What you have to do as a coach, and even though a lot of what you're bringing to the exercise pool or to however you write your program are exercises similar to what we're going to use in the gym for any strength sport, we've got to show the value to them of how it can help them as a football player. So, and then for the skilled athletes, where it's not as in it's all important because of the protection part. Let's just start there. So you can give value to most athletes by saying, hey, we're going to design programs that help protect the body armor. What does that mean? To me, it's very unique and specific attack plans for different needs analysis parts of the body that are general commonality areas of the body that continually get hurt, not only in football, but in all sports. But the biggest thing you have to do with the athletes who don't see the weight room has any value is, how can you talk with them and build a relationship and get them to understand that, hey, I can build you what I call a purposeful program. Like, I'm not expecting you to lift like the O-lineman. I'm not expecting you to do what I call structural lifts at the rate of an offensive lineman who's been in the league 5 years versus 1 year versus 10 years. I'm going to look at it from introducing to you what I call athletic movements, more single joint or single limb movements that have some open and closed cyclical movements, like a step up or a lunge for lower body instead of your traditional bilateral squat. That, when you make it to the NFL, you've already proven your capabilities physically. Now it's, how do I continue to do my job? Because my ultimate job for them really is career longevity at the NFL. Like the college level football player, you're developing strength. There's a lot more rigidity in some of the things you're going to do with a college athlete, especially very early in their career. It's changed a lot now with this transfer portal because you don't get the kids as long. So that whole like developmental quadrennial plan work that I was a big believer in when I was in college has kind of disappeared, unless you're at a Division II or Division III school. And even then, if you get good enough, you're going to transfer up. At the pros, it's a management system. It's meeting the athlete where they are. What are they willing to do? Because if you can build a plan on exercises and movements that they're willing to do, then the buy-in becomes greater because it becomes more of a, hey man, he's working with me. This isn't one of those things where I got to do a snatch or I got to do a clean. Well, there's no value in a 10-year vet who's played safety and has had 3 knee injuries doing cleans and snatches. But you can do things that simulate, like we were talking. You can do some throws. You can do some weighted jumps, depending on how, and then during the season, it's just a full-blown auto regulation. How do these guys come out of the competition on Sunday? What do they need to replenish their gas tanks for next Sunday? Because the one thing that you have to understand is there's only one goal in the NFL once the season starts, is get that guy to Sunday. So no matter what people think and no matter what people want to say, there's a lot of different ways to get a guy to Sunday. And that might mean he spends the whole time in the training room and sees you very little. That might mean, depending on how hard he practices, you may reduce volumes, whether he gets a day off of practice and then he makes that volume up in the weight room with some extra work, or he practices his butt off and you're going to reduce some volume on your end, because again, it's an evaluation of, now there's data that we can rapidly get it with the age of technology that's available. But a lot of it, to me, still is the human art of coaching and the emotional quotient of the athlete. High achievers can fight through fatigue. Guys who just don't see value in the weight room will look for ways to figure out, how can I get the least amount done and still be able to not get fined or not get turned in for missing a lift. So those are some of the things that you have to be aware of at the NFL level, where in the college level, guy misses a workout, he's doing up downs. You're doing something stupid punishment. He's going to, and even then, miss too many workouts, you're probably going to lose your scholarship. So it's you have to really be aware of how situational environments and society has changed how kids are. Like, you hear it all the time, right? Oh, these guys are soft. These guys are soft. Are they soft, or are they just doing what the societal changes have made the rules different? Like you have older coaches who just continue to say, these guys never would have made it through a traditional 2-a-days, or hell, we had 3-a-days. You don't know that because they've never been asked to do that. I'm sure if there was still traditional 2-a-days, these guys would adapt and go through traditional 2-a-days. Just like anybody else. It's the one thing you can learn from high-level strongman athletes, and more importantly, from a metabolic demand and energy system demand, professional CrossFitters are, the body will adapt to imposed demands. Now, when you're dealing with elite level football players, you probably can get similar responses. If you're dealing with lower level athletes, they're probably going to tend to figure out that they may get injured because they're not a quality-based athlete to do the demands of certain things that are exposure. And that's why when you look at all these charts about the ones who make it to the top, the percentage is minute. For every person that says they participate in CrossFit, only 40 show up to the CrossFit games. Do the math. I guarantee that's probably less than 1%. Same thing with the strongest men. How many people are out there? There's over 400 athletes that were at OSG this year. And the truth is only 30 get invited to World's Strongest Man.
Part of what made you successful in the NFL was like emotional intelligence and just working with the athletes and what they needed and modifying your program based on the needs of the individual athletes. So then after your NFL career, like we mentioned, you did start working with Brian Shaw. You've done more with strongman since. You've continued to get involved. And looking back on it now, with your experiences, what would you have changed about how some of the ways you would have programmed your football players? What kind of strongman events would you just like, you kind of were just like, man, if I could go back, I'd put this and this in there. It's like, what strongman specific would you incorporate in the NFL? And then what would you recommend also? So the NFL is the big question. And then also, what would you maybe recommend for high school level football coaches?
Let's start with high school first, because I think that's a little simpler. You got first the biggest thing with, and let's talk linemen more so than the rest, because that's a different type of conditioning in this day and age. You have to. I like the yoke, but that would take a lot more preparation in core strength and even posterior shoulder strength and upper back strength to secure the yoke properly, so that because again, you're asking the athlete to run with a load and compress the spine. So there's certain things from a safety aspect that you want to be aware of. But the number one conditioner would be farmer's walks, because you can manipulate that a lot easier. And I've always said the safe bet, on average, everybody's different, but the safe bet to start a conditioning program with a farmer's walk is to take the total implement and start at the body weight of the athlete. So if a 300-pound athlete were going to do it, you'd have 150 per implement. And then you want to just gradually build certain demands. So for me, I'm big on 3-to-1 rest ratio, right at that ATP PC rest. And if the weights get heavier, you can expand out a little bit longer. But I like a 15-second work and 45-second for any type of strongman type of interval work that I would do with the farmers. I do like tire flips, but tire flips are an interesting issue, because if you don't teach the lift correctly, there's a very high incidence of bicep injuries. And if you get a poor tire with bad knobs where it's worn out more, you could have a lot of finger tendon and ligament issues with your fingers. I've seen that happen. So for me, we did a lot of tire flips when I was at Boise State. We had 20 or 30 tires. And again, I'm not talking about 500-pound tires. I'm talking about 200, 250. We had a 570, and that was more for us. And we had one track and field athlete that was just a phenom, a 2-time Olympian, that he would do it. But for most of it, it was just because it was good triple extension. And when you do it correctly, where Olympic lift, you're staying vertical. With the tire flip, you're driving at that same typical angle as a lineman or somebody coming off the line of scrimmage. So there is a unique technique to it. But a lot of it too is if you have mobility issues, you'll be in a poor starting position because of where you have to put your hands to get a proper flip on the tire. So from the high school level, I would recommend the farmer's walk, but I'd also recommend light sandbag or light med ball carries, or even like grabbing kettlebells or some type of dumbbells to start off with farmer's walks. Single arm too, like the single arm work for core strength, single arm walks. Those would be ideal for a combination of conditioning and core strength, and that can be done with any athlete. But the sandbag carries I think, have a lot of merit, but you also have to learn how to breathe. So there's always that teaching concept where the coach has to understand, hey, sounds real good, but if you're not understanding of certain things behind it, pick this up and run with it. Sounds great, but if you don't have your breathing down, you're going to pass out.
So this
And
is kind of more just this is kind of like a little out of left field question. My background is I was a swimmer, and that's where I learned to breathe because I mean, you can't take a breath underwater. And when your head
right.
comes up, and when your head comes up on your stroke, you have to take your breath in. So you really learn really good breath pacing as a swimmer. Have you ever done that as a coach? Like just put your guys in water to teach them how to breathe?
No, I mean, that's a good idea. No, a lot of it, because, a lot of us, the only thing we taught breathing was the Valsalva maneuver, right?
Oh yeah.
Hold your breath and hold it as long as you can. And, and
Try not to
everybody,
pass out.
you try. And it's funny because even yesterday, although, the loads, I was doing some banded accommodating resistance. And a lot of times after a set, I'll kind of get dizzy because of the amount of focus, so to speak, and the fact that I'm really locking in and engaging myself and giving the Valsalva technique because of previous injuries. I kind of overshift and focus towards making them like I'm very deliberate on, especially on deadlifts, of my starting push off the deck. How I'm very deliberate and patient, sometimes too patient, but that's how I build my confidence, and that's how I know I'm going to have a successful lift. So there's a lot more into it than just saying, oh, these are the exercises, because then you got to look at it from, okay, how do I keep these kids safe? Because we have to remember too, most people who see from the outside see you doing strongman events with high school, college, or even the NFL type of guys. They don't relate that to weight room. So they can look at it from, hey, you hurt my kid on a movement or a drill he shouldn't have been doing. We're going to come after you. So you have to be situational aware. Like a buddy of mine who's a strength coach said, you should always have a lawyer on retainer because of the risk that you could actually get yourself into if something catastrophic happens to an athlete under your care. So again, if you can get the breathing right, I think there's value in some type of sand. But again, like we were talking earlier, I'm not talking about competition loads. I'm not talking about a 400-pound sandbag for an NFL lineman. I'm talking about a 200-pound bag. Because again, for him, it's not a one-shot deal. For him, you got to remember, most of these guys are going to, especially offensive linemen, never come off the field. They can play anywhere between 60 and 80 snaps in a game. So for them, it's not how heavy can they do something one time. It's how many times can they repeat it at the same level of intensity with a very brief rest. So it's not so much the load that has value, it's the event that has value. And I think a lot of times young coaches get carried away with the load. It's not the load, it's the movement. And remember, if I'm training a strong man, that's his game. This is just a way to maybe make it a little bit more funner for an athlete who maybe is tired of being in the weight room all the time. And that's how we introduced it at Boise State, was we got to get these guys out of the weight room. Like all we do is lift. And we would go we were right off the Boise River. We'd go down and on low tide, pick up the river rocks and the stones, all different. And okay, everybody press, pass the block, pass the rock. Everybody do a press, everybody do a row. Everybody do a goblet squat, or a Zercher squat, or however you were gonna, and then we
Just love that.
yeah, it was fun. I mean, at times they loved it, but not when you're getting yelled and screamed at. And then
Yeah.
we'd make them jog back to the campus with the stones, and we have this giant pile of stones in the weight room. But yeah, it was just a way for us to, we called it, I actually presented, I think it was 1998 at the coaches conference. I think it was called Junkyard Gym, kettlebells, kegs, and tires and river rocks or something like that. But yeah, so, and then what we had talked before we started recording, the one big one that I would, and we threw kegs, but now with the sandbags types of things, I would really get into more throws for height. And again, nothing crazy, 25, 30, 35 pounds for the big guys, 20 pounds for the skills, and just launch them. Like really just work on extension. And like we said, it's no different than we're already out there throwing med balls. So for me, I think that would be extremely beneficial, especially for the guys who are at that point in their career where if you do believe in utilizing variations of the Olympic lifts, what a way to transfer out of that for a guy who's been in the league
100%.
6 or 7 years and has no want to catch a clean anymore. And so I
Well,
would
and it's
say
such a
for me,
great like way for them to track like that external force.
and
Like even
releasing stuff, and that's what athletics are. Like, there's not,
yeah.
at sometimes you have that yielding force, especially when two linemen can collide. But a lot of times you're finishing on air, especially your
Hmm.
skill guys. So there's a lot of merit to me to the throws with a little heavier throw than your standard med ball. If I had to pick, I would do a farmer's carry, double and single, some type of sandbag carry only with my bigs, but I would do a lot of throws. I would utilize that a lot. And then there's you can do some pulling the sled, like a upper body sled pull with a rope. That could be a good change up for upper body conditioning for your linemen. It would challenge them. Everybody's pushing sled. So some type of sled push, but we don't do a lot of sled pulling as far as like taking a prowler or a heavier sled and strapping them in and almost getting them to crawl with it. Most of the
Did
time
you
we're
ever
behind it.
so I know you're friends with Van Hatfield. Did you ever go pull his giant anchor chain?
No, but I'd love to have one of those.
Oh
And yeah,
man,
the
that
big ones
thing's a
like the Navy
monster.
shipyard chains. Yeah, I want
Yeah.
just a few foot of that. I want one of those bad.
That's all it needs. You only need like I think like 4 links is like I think they're like 100 pounds a chain link, and
Yeah,
Van has one. I think it's like 400 or 500 pounds, and it's a monster to drag. Because you go to pick it up, you're like, oh, how hard this can this be, and you're like, oh man, that was a deadlift.
and that's one too, like a backwards drag for knee health. That would be
Huge,
something that would be kind of cool. Now that we're
huge.
talking about that, so yeah, and again, I think that the biggest thing I can tell the sporting coach, remember, don't get carried away with the load. Find the load range that fits most of your athletes and then try to increase the repetitions. Like, even if you want to do, hey, we're going to do, a 15-yard carry, even if it's not for time, we're going to do a 15-yard carry with a minute rest, and you're going to do 20 of them. I'd venture to think that'd be a pretty good conditioning day.
Yeah, no, and that's even a good takeaway for me, like just even for myself, because I'm still doing strongman, but it's like sometimes I just get caught up. I'm like, oh man, I got to keep squatting, I got to keep doing stuff with the barbell to build up to my stuff. But it's like that does get boring sometimes. And it's okay for me to grab a sandbag and hold on to a sandbag and do squats with a sandbag. Like those are allowed. And that's a good way to mix up training if you're getting bored. You
I'll tell you
mentioned,
another good one before we jump into it that I do like with the yoke is a Zercher walk with the yoke.
yeah.
That's a great core one, and it takes some of the stress off the spine, and it's super hard.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. And you surprisingly get a lot in like the glutes and the hamstrings. Like
Yeah,
people
I
don't
mean,
realize how much glute work Zercher walks are. Like it's
that's
insane.
not.
But I was just gonna ask, so I'm not well read on this, but knees and shoulders are probably your two biggest injuries in the NFL. Is that right?
Though shoulder, well, knee, yes, because of the way the game's played. Shoulder, those would be your two, what I would call your orthopedic issues.
Trauma based
Yes,
things. Okay.
but your soft tissue with the hamstring resiliency and with your skilled athletes, especially defensive players, your linebackers, your corners, and your safeties, you really got to watch out for the groin area, the abductors and stuff. So if you're sticking to like sagittal plane movements, you're probably not doing them as a service. You need to work multiple planes and working the frontal plane as well as the transverse plane. And then for me, that's like a lot of combinations of what I call a squat and a lunge. And the difference between a squat and a lunge is a squat is your feet are in place and you just line up in that plane, and a lunge is a step and replace. So it's like a cyclical movement. And those are how we separate what the difference is between like a transverse lunge to a transverse squat. It's the same
Hmm.
angles, so to speak, except one is an in-place event and one is a cyclical, more of an pure athletic event. So there's things like that.
So you mentioned the sled drag. What would be like, let's just say your top three, doesn't have to be perfect, but your top three off the top of your head for knee health for football players? Like what top three strongman exercises would help football players keep their knees healthy?
Well, I think anything going backwards. So a sled drag, and if you with a handle with a pull, because you'll have to squat down. I think a backwards farmer's walk, walking backwards with a farmer's walk.
Okay. I have
Yeah.
never tried that. I'm
Yeah.
going to put that in my rotation.
Yeah. So go ahead and if you go like 30 feet down, 30 feet back. I
Oh
actually
man.
had Brian do some of that with his conditioning early in phase one of the developmental work, non-competitive stages.
How much lighter do you make that? Because usually we teach the
Yeah,
farmer walk
super
is
light.
you lean
Yeah.
forward and you keep the weight over the
Yeah, we
midfoot to
do
keep
that
you
on the light.
running.
Like I said, that would be well for Brian. I think he had 260 a hand.
Yeah, well, I'm not Brian.
No, so you would probably have 100 a hand.
Thank you for giving me
Yeah,
that.
like I said, for me, I always like you're a competitive strongman athlete, so you could do a little bit more. But for me, when I do forward and back, like I'll use again, I weigh 280. I'll have 125 to 140 a hand.
But you stay upright.
Yeah, well, on the way down, I'm going pretty. Way back, you're going to be more in that. But and then it's I like to go heel toe down as fast as I can to really, and then coming back, it's almost toe heel because that's where you're really going to
Okay.
fire that quad up. I've done backwards yoke walk. Anything with a pull backwards is going to
See, that's
help the
interesting
knee.
because I've never thought to do yoke or farmers backwards. So that one was like, I'm like absolutely integrating that this week. That's
Yeah,
really
but I mean,
exciting.
again, in your training specifically for your sport is I got to move from start 75 feet, 60 feet, 100 feet, whatever it is, as fast as I can.
Mm-hmm.
There is no, there's no real recollection for you to do that when we're looking at it from a standpoint of conditioning based and we're
Mm-hmm.
athletics. Most athletes, regardless of position, are going to have to move backwards.
Yeah,
It depends.
absolutely.
A lineman now is very specific with their kick slide, but even in the defensive lineman, they may be asked to do a spy technique where they step and then they push him back into coverage while they blitz another player off the edge. So there's always, and I'm a huge component in my conditioning plans of backwards running anyway, although it's more anecdotal. There's a lot of people who believe backwards running is very good for hamstring resiliency. So we're always going to put in that component. But with a loaded backwards walk, it really is good for knee health. Like I only, because I walk so much, part of my conditioning, when I do sled drags at least once a week will be on my deadlift or squat big lift of the week, which is Wednesdays for me. I always go out and do at least 10 reps of probably somewhere on average 120 feet of a backwards drag. Not a whole lot of weight. It's more of like a recovery for the session, but that's really done and because it's all concentric, it really has helped because my quad to hamstring ratio is not ideal because I've never really trained quad, so to speak. And after having multiple ACL injuries, all you do is train your hamstrings. So there's a deficiency there. And it's also good for your hips because, again, 99% of the time we're moving forward. And I'm a big believer you got to train some of the opposite patterns too.
Yeah. Joe, this has been so much fun. I feel like we could talk for another hours and hours.
We could do multiple parts, I guess.
Oh, 100%. So I've been closing everything out with everyone asking, what has been one of your favorite moments in Strongman? And I know that's an unfair question to ask my guys who've been in it forever. Like when I asked Chad Coy that, he was like, "Oh man, come on, it's not fair."
Yeah, so
but you got to pick one.
Chad's competed. Well, for me, probably because I was part of the team, and although not as involved as I was for the 2 World's Strongest Men, was watching Brian beat. I was there live as Chad was when Brian finished his career winning the Strongest Man on Earth, his last show. That was kind of surreal. You couldn't have asked for probably a better ending, and the fact that he had just gotten the rights to that title, to be able to utilize the World's Strongest Man on Earth title, because as you know, strongman's about titles, right? We all can have our debates about, is World's Strongest Man really determining who the World's Strongest Man is? Probably not, but they got the title, they got the name, and everybody wants that name. So they're always going to have people that can compete. But there's a reason why the Todds built the Arnold, because that was supposed to be the true test of who's the strongest person in the world. And that's because it was more static based and it was inside, so there wasn't a whole lot of movement. And if there was, it was a tremendous amount of weight for a very short distance. Then Brian started the Shaw Classic, which is super heavy. And the Rogue is kind of somewhere in between. They got some heavy, they got some others. But so now, you got the Grand Slam events of strongman. If you win those, if you win enough of those, you can kind of put your stamp that you're one of the classified strongest people ever to walk the face of the earth.
Joe, that's awesome. I bet that was just such an incredible, surreal moment for you. I can't even imagine what that would be like to have that moment with your athlete. It's like, I don't know if you ever saw the Disney movie Hercules and little Philatides.
Yeah.
His little thing is he's just like, I just want to see my hero's name up in the stars.
Yeah.
And that's like, I think that's all coaches ever want, is they just want to see their boy, his name written in the stars, and you got that moment. So that's cool.
Yeah, you take, like you said, if you're going to be there, like I always tell people, when Brian brought me on, his goal was to win his 5th title. We didn't do that. So we failed. And I'm part of that failure. And people they look at you kind of funny, like, hey man, he brought me on to win a 5th title. We didn't win the title. We failed. I mean, you got to accept that. So for him to be able to create that motivation for that one last time and to go out and to perform the way he did, because, World's Strongest Man for the Masters age athlete, it's really a test of recovery regardless of the events. And in Brian's case, especially the very last year, he had to go against one of the best. He misses winning his group by a half a point because he, again, didn't take his breath correctly on the wheel, on the Conan's wheel. So he comes in one place better in his group on the Conan's wheel. He's in the finals without the stone off. That changes the whole complexity of his final outcome because he doesn't have to expend anything in the stone off. And then to make matters worse, he's in a stone off probably against the next best stone lifter he could go against, and they wind up doing 11 reps. Well, you have no capability to recover in less than a day when you're 41 years old, 400 and let's say 50 pounds, and your goal is to win World's Strongest Man, but more importantly, your legacy is the 15th final in a row. The psychological and emotional arousal that he had to use to make sure that he did not fail, that in itself is something that it's hard for athletes to recover from.
Yeah. Well, Joe, again, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your insight. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for thinking of me and inviting me. And then, like I said, I'll be more than happy to jump on again if you think there's value to it.